And you let me know when, Steve. Great. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Sarah Gott-Wallace, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Dr. Talbot Spivak Holocaust Memorial Committee. So today it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Samuel Varsano. Sam was born in Salonika, Greece at the end of World War II to Holocaust survivors of Sephardic descent. Raise your hand if you've heard from a Holocaust survivor before. So have you heard from the child of a Holocaust survivor before? So this will be a treat for a lot of you. Sam's father was a survivor of Auschwitz, and he was also a survivor of a death march to Mauthausen, where Mauthausen was liberated by the American forces in 1945. Sam's mother was a hidden child rescued by righteous Christians in northern Greece. And his family immigrated to the United States in the early 1950s during the Greek Civil War. And they settled in Syracuse, New York as war refugees with the help of Jewish community in Syracuse, New York. After graduation from both Cornell University and Farley Dickinson University, where he received his MBA, Sam and his wife Anne settled in New Jersey, where he began his business career. His passion for history resulted in a commitment to Holocaust education, and he was a member of the Holocaust Commission for the New Jersey Department of Education, where he co-authored a statewide curriculum on the Holocaust in Greece. So he knows a lot about what he's talking about today. So as you're sitting there, jot down questions for him as well, because he's saving a good amount of time at the end for us to have Q&A and have a little discussion. We're going to bring in some other aspects of his story as well. Sam has spoken frequently for the Jewish Federation in New Jersey, as well as numerous synagogues on both the Holocaust and his Sephardic heritage. And now it is our honor and pleasure to have him speaking to us on this very interesting topic. And so without further ado, I present to you Mr. Sam Varsano.
Great introduction. Who wrote that? Is this microphone coming across okay? Can you all hear it? Before starting, I want to tell you that I am delighted to be joining you at this wonderful school today. I've really been enjoying, enjoying it, sitting outside with all of you going back and forth. And it's been a long time since I've been myself a student on a college campus, but I was at one last year for my granddaughter's graduation. So that's all in the future for you guys. As Professor Gottwald said, I am going to leave specific amount of time at the end of this to give you the opportunity to comment or to ask whatever questions you'd like to ask. I want to tell you that this subject, not Salonika, but the subject of the Holocaust, is a very difficult subject for survivors, for the children of survivors, for people who know anything being embedded in the subject. And very often they prefer not to engage or to discuss some of the more painful aspects of it. I feel that I'm duty bound to respond to whatever questions you have, and I'm prepared for that. And they can include things like what family life was like, what about the impact on my children? I have two sons, and things like that. So don't feel like you have to hold yourselves back. I'm going to leave that time for you at the end, okay? Before I start, how many of you have ever heard of Salonika? Anyone? There's a Greek girl in the class, isn't there?
It's my other class.
Oh, okay. Okay. So you've never heard of it? Okay, in a moment, I'm going to show you a map and you'll identify where it is and get your bearings for where it's located in Europe. Okay, so let's get started. I have to admit that the title of this talk must seem curious to you because most people have heard very little about Salonika or even where it's located. And as I said, in a moment, I'm going to show you where it is. Other questions that come up: what does Salonika have to do with the Holocaust? Were there any Jews there in the first place? Doesn't Warsaw, Budapest, or Prague make much more sense? They were much more associated with the Nazi invasions. Let me examine a little bit of the history so we can have some perspective. This is the exciting part. Oh, it works. Okay. Salonika is right there at that opening in the Gulf. This is Greece. And it also has the name Thessaloniki. This is a map of the Jewish world from the 15th century. That's the 1400s. We're talking about the time of Columbus. You can see from this that the Jews were spread out throughout the Mediterranean, with the largest concentrations being in Spain and in Portugal. Jews were present there after being expelled from the Holy Land after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. As a result, Salonika, or the other name Thessaloniki in Hellenic Greek nomenclature, has had a meaningful Jewish presence in Salonika for more than 2,000 years. It appears prominently in the New Testament in Paul's letters to the Thessalonians. Notable among those people he addressed in his letters were his fellow Jews who were living there, and a significant number of Christians who had already converted to Christianity from paganism. In fact, Holocaust scholars have projected that in the mid-15th century, at the time of this map, Spain and Portugal contained approximately 75% of the entire world's Jewish population. The golden age of Jewish life in the Balkans really began after the Spanish Inquisition, which is an event that might better be described as the expulsion or the forced conversion of the Jews in Spain and Portugal. These were the Sephardic or Spanish Jews, which is the way I describe myself, who preferred expulsion to conversion. Although still a distinct minority in the population of the world, they were able to reach the heights of economic and political power in the courts of kings and queens in Europe, functioning as court physicians, diplomats, and academics. A prime example would be this gentleman, Moses Maimonides, who is a well-known philosopher from the Middle Ages. So what prompted the dramatic change in policy regarding the Jews that resulted in the mass expulsions? Early in the 13th century, Pope Innocent III issued a papal edict, or what the Vatican calls a papal bull, that would have dire consequences for the Sephardic Jews of Europe. Sephardic again means Spanish. Let's look at it. This is the actual papal bull from Pope Innocent, and this is from the 13th century. In the red highlights, you see that in the first paragraph, the Pope says there's complete protection for all the Jews, as long as they did no plotting against the subversion of the Christian faith. I guess there was an implication there that some Jews plot against Christianity, and for them, there is no protection from the Pope against violence. He also cited specific things that people could not do. No intermarriage with Jews, no consumption of foods associated with or prepared by Jews. Christians could not be employed in Jewish homes as servants or in business unless, in case they would be exposed to Jewish diseases. Don't forget, this is the Middle Ages, so the biggest plague was the Black Plague, the Black Death. But unlike the world situation of the 20th century, the Jews of Iberia, Spain, and Portugal were invited to resettle in the Ottoman Empire by Sultan Bayezid II. The Ottoman Empire you can think of as being the Turkish Empire today. Although that's a representation of him. Although there was migration to present-day Turkey, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and North Africa, by far the most desirable destination was Salonika. Inquisition scholars say that Bayezid prized the exceptional talent of the Sephardic Jews for a very specific reason. In business and in banking, the Muslim Ottomans were not allowed by religious law to take on critical economic activities like money changing or charging interest on bank loans. In addition, the Sultan viewed the Jews as his fellow Semites descended from Abraham, so Ottomans felt much more comfortable with them. Salonika remained an important center of Jewish commerce and learning up until its total destruction in 1943. And at the time, it was notable in all of Europe as the only major city in the world with a majority Jewish population. By 1943, the Sephardim had founded a study center, established a Jewish hospital, an old age home, built their own schools, and were a dominant presence not only in the seaport, but also in the life of all of Salonika. That is why the Nazis targeted Greece and specifically Salonika for invasion. That destruction raised some wrenching questions among the few remaining survivors. How could the Jews not know what the Nazis intended for them? Where were the leaders of the Jewish community? Couldn't more people be saved? Of all the communities in post-World War II Europe, the Jews of Greece had the most reason to be tormented by these questions. In his book, The Holocaust in Salonika, Professor Stephen Bowman of the University of Cincinnati provides compelling insight into one of the most important and unique Jewish communities in Europe. Bowman edits and provides the introductory essay in 3 eyewitness accounts of the annihilation of Salonika Jewry as translated by Isaac Ben-Mayor. These accounts are a blow-by-blow depiction of the Nazi liquidation machine working at top efficiency. Reading their account, one is left with the impression that the Nazis had a seemingly naive, if unwitting partner, the highly regarded Jewish Community Council, the leadership of the Jewish community. They felt that although ruthless, the Germans were still very practical, and Salonika had much to offer them in exchange for allowing them to maintain the status quo, leave them alone. so they would prove themselves invaluable to the Germans. Where persuasion or pleading from intermediaries failed, they would succeed with negotiation or bribery. They would give them what they wanted in money, material goods, labor, detailed lists of their citizens and their personal properties. They would meet their impossible demands as quickly as possible, sometimes even ahead of schedule. Surely the Nazis would be impressed and loosen their repressive grip. The formula seemed to work for almost 2 years. Then in February of 1943, with all the wealth confiscated and the population data neatly in hand, the Nazis gathered the Jews of Salonika into 2 ghettos and promptly sent them off to Auschwitz. Before being transported, the Jews were to suffer a special humiliation. The commander of the SS troops in Salonika, Alois Brunner, that's him on the left, ordered that all the Jews be taken to the city's Freedom Square, and in temperatures above 90 degrees, the men were forced to perform strenuous calisthenics for many hours to the amusement of the SS guards. Those who succumbed to the heat and the strain were dragged away or encountered brutal treatment by the guards. Finally, in early evening, the men were allowed to return to their homes to the relief of their families. You may be familiar with the name of the junior SS officer who assisted Brunner in the deportation. There he was. His name is Kurt Waldheim. He claimed he was a law student during World War II, but it turns out he wasn't in law school. Documentation was provided after the war that documented exactly where Waldheim was. He was in Salonika, and he was the Nazi officer who directed all of these activities. Upon arrival in Auschwitz, the largest and the most notorious of all the death camps, the Jewish prisoners were separated into 2 lines, one for the able-bodied men and the second for women and children. Single women were also judged for their ability to work in forced labor, and they were spared temporarily. The men and women thought to be of little use for labor because of poor health, disability, or advanced age, along with any of the children, were directed to the showers for disinfection. As we know, this was really a death sentence because their first destinations in Auschwitz were really the gas chambers, disguised as showers. You may be interested to see what one of the registration documents looked like for a person who passed the first selection and was admitted to the camp. This is an actual document from 1943. And although I rarely talk about it, I'm making an exception now because of the fact that you're young people and you deserve to be able to see what the actual data was. This is the actual form filled out by a Nazi officer as my father was moved from the selection line into the camp. You can see a number of lines for yourself. Let me just show you what some of the things recorded looked like. This line indicates that he came from Greece. This is his name or his father's name. This line details that he was married, that this is the name of his wife, and that he had one son. This line indicates that he spoke fluently Italian, Greek, and Spanish, which was his native language. These lines are really interesting. This line describes his nose, the shape of his nose and size of his nose, the color of his hair, and here we're talking about eyes and also ears. I couldn't imagine, why would they want to know all of this? But they cataloged all of this because if nothing at all, the Nazis were committed social Darwinists. You know what I mean by that? I'm sure you do. So they were looking at examining all that they could on the makeup of the people, the human beings. And this led ultimately to a number of experimental surgeries that they did on these people. The first eyewitness account is a memoir written by the community's lawyer. He wrote it while hiding in Athens after the deportation of Salonica's 70,000 Jews to Poland. Although it is crafted with the explicit detail one might expect in a legal affidavit, the memoir still manages to convey the reflection of a man who cannot believe what is happening as it's happening. On almost every page, one senses an unspoken question. Did the can-do efficiency and organizational ferocity of the Salonika Community Council inadvertently contribute to the disaster that fell on to all the people? Professor Bowman advises in the preface that this memoir should be read as an apology, and by extension, his colleagues in leadership. One is hard pressed to think otherwise. We should talk about this in the Q&A because it is something that was experienced by a number of other communities in Europe. Unlike Yaakov L., who was discovered in Athens and deported to Poland in 1944, Dr. Isaac Matarazzo managed to survive the war. He also wrote a lengthy retrospective on the events of the occupation between 41 and 43. Without as much detail, Matarazzo tells much the same story, but brings another important perspective into view. As a physician and a survivor, he makes more of a clinical judgment about the health of the community, such as it was after liberation and repatriation. He notes the discomfort of those who survived in hiding, reuniting with survivors of the death camp after they came back. Here again, we realize the strain within a community that cannot celebrate liberation and freedom because some are questioning and some are defending whether family and friends were abandoned in order to save one's own life. The third memoir is from Solomon Uziel, which is the most haunting of the three, in my opinion. His writing is a personal defense of his behavior as a community leader during the occupation. Upon his return from the death camps, he finds the remnants of the Jewish community in turmoil and discontent. he finds a community in disbelief that with all its reputed savvy and wealth, it still encountered the most terrible of fates. As one of the most visible leaders to have survived, Uziel becomes the target of a whispering campaign. There was little mood for healing and rebuilding. A community whose ego had been destroyed every bit as much as the wealth and infrastructure was now demanding its pound of flesh. An inquest was formed to determine which of the citizens should be identified as collaborators. Uziel writes passionately of his sincere and selfless efforts for his fellow Jews. He confronts every whispered claim and demands a public court of inquiry to investigate each one. At one point, he rebuts Dr. Matarasso by exposing how the physician and his Aryan wife escaped from a Salonika, leaving behind Matarasso's aged father in an old age home. It was left to Uziel and others to collect the old man, bring him to the train station for deportation to the camps. He takes elaborate measures to clear his name in an effort to rejoin Salonican society, but finds himself constantly trying to, quote unquote, unring the bell. Salonika has become a place of ugliness and recrimination. Less than 10 years after most of the remaining Jews had emigrated to Israel or the United States. By the year 2000, fewer than 1,000 Jews living almost invisibly remained in the Jerusalem of the Balkans. That's what happened. I think I'm going to stop here because this may cause you to think about what you might like to ask. But I think I'll start with my own question. It's a question that I had as a child. And I asked this question of my own parents. But I'm curious about how you might feel about it. And the question is, what would you do? What do you think you would do if in the same situation, a government was coming after people, specific people, and the punishment, if they caught them, might start with jailing, but would escalate quickly to murder? Would you consider rescuing people and bringing them into your own home or hiding them? If you want to raise your hands, I'm happy to hear it. Shoot.
I don't know if I necessarily like hide them, but I think I would try to support them and give them resources, but not have them like in my house.
How would you do it? Where would you give them the resources if not in your house? The problem was that they were exposed out on the street, even in the forests. So they were subject to being picked up, taken away. It really required a considerable amount of courage for a non-Jewish person to take one in and protect them.
If I was in the ability to, I might try to help them like get out of the country if you're closer to the border, but if you're more centralized, the best I could do is maybe help them find another family that's closer.
Another what?
Another family that's closer or has more means to getting out. I'm assuming we're probably poor.
It wasn't really an economic thing. Problem was that all the seaports were closed. There was a huge navy available to the Germans. And it was very difficult for people to escape out of Greece that way. What the people who did escape tried to do was to get up north into the mountains and be hidden there. My mother did that. she was taken as a teenager by people who had agreed to protect her life, and she was taken into the mountains of northern Greece under the pretext that her parents had died in an accident, and she was, I think, 17 years old. Her parents had not died in an accident, but they took her in so they could tell the story to everyone else. But here's the most important thing to know. They took her to a tiny village, farming village in northern Greece. But all the people who were in that village listened to her speak and realized she came from the city and correctly guessed that she was Jewish. And every single one of them kept her secret and joined in protecting her throughout the rest of the war. So my question to you is the same question I asked myself. Would I do that? Could I do that? The penalty for doing that, just so you know, is that if you got named as someone who did something like that, not only would you be picked up, your spouse, your wife would be picked up. That would mean the end of her life, plus your children and any siblings. And for that matter, anybody who lived near you in that village. So you really had the weight of responsibility of an entire community that was hanging on your decision. That's a pretty big decision. I had this question put to me, you'll be surprised by this, by my own students when I was still teaching high school a few years ago. I taught about the Holocaust, but I also was an American history teacher. And my students would say to me, Mr. V, what would you do? Knowing that this is the ultimate question. So my answer was, I don't know. I'd like to think that I would save them. I'd like to think that of myself. But going further with the implications of saving someone who was being pursued by an evil government and the consequences of saving them being so dire, I don't know what I would do. I would be really conflicted. But that's what the nature of an autocracy that is cruel and evil can be to its people and its society. So at this point, I'm going to tell you that I appreciate your attention and your grace in listening to the story. It's not an easy one to absorb, but I think it's an important story to tell because those of us who are still alive and connected to it need to do it. Otherwise, no one will hear about it and know about it. And we should make sure that we all operate together to prevent this kind of thing not only happening in this country, but in other countries, if we can help it. So I'm now free for you to ask anything that you'd like to. Go ahead. Well, let me see if there's anyone else besides you two. You're just doing your hair, right? Okay.
How old was your father when he got out? Sorry, how old was your father when he got out of the, because like you said your father and his father and mother were taken, right?
They weren't together. My father